bringing attention to the destruction of the 3 World Trade Center towers in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and a whole lot more. This is 9/11 Free Fall. Good evening, everyone. This is your host, Andy Steele. Thank you again for joining me tonight on this special anniversary edition of 9/11 Free Fall. Anniversary edition, of course, because this program is airing on September 11th, 2014. That's 13 years after the event that changed so much about our country and continues to shape our present and our future. And the event I'm talking about, of course, is the controlled demolitions of Towers 1, 2, and 7 in New York City on that day, an event that has been lied about by our government, by our media, continues to be covered up, despite obvious evidence that this is the case, that fire alone did not bring these buildings down. And that's what the show is about. It's about exposing that. It's about highlighting the experts and scholars who have been out there with loud voices telling the American public, telling the world about the evidence that proves this. And I'm happy to have as my guest tonight one of the people who was out there early talking about this issue, Professor Stephen Jones, BYU professor, retired, early forced retirement that he had to endure because he was speaking out. So he talks about that in this interview that I'm going to play for you. Talks about the controlled demolition evidence from his own perspective, and he also talks about some other things too, about some of his work with energy. Very fascinating stuff. Guy knows a lot. Is published in a lot of journals, not just about 9/11, but about the energy issue too. So I'll be playing that for you in just a minute. Before I do play that for you, though, what we're going to do is what we do every week. We're going to take 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and all the people who died in the wars that followed 9/11. We'll do that beginning now. And that is 10 seconds.
Today's guest should need no introduction to our audience. He was one of the early people coming out and challenging the government's official account of what happened to the Twin Towers in Building 7 on 9/11. He has a BS in physics with a mathematics minor, magna cum laude with honors from Brigham Young University. He got that in 1973. And he's got a PhD in physics with a mathematics and electronics minors from Vanderbilt University. He was a professor at BYU, and he's given many lectures about the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence around the country, and he's also one of the authors of the famous nanothermite paper with Niels Harrit and others in the Open Chemical Physics Journal that was published back in April of 2009. I'm talking about Professor Stephen Jones. Professor Jones, welcome to 9/11 Freefall.
Thanks very much, Andy. It's a pleasure to be with you here today.
Well, it's long overdue, and I'm glad to have you on finally, and we got you on for this very special episode because this is airing on the anniversary of 9/11, and I guess this is kind of goes personally for me why I wanted you on, because here we are 13 years later. I've been at this for many years, and I think one of the first people I heard talking about this and laying out the evidence was yourself. I was watching television as you were on Tucker Carlson, so this is kind of a special for me to have you on. So before we dive into 9/11 and the controlled demolition evidence from your own words, tell us a little bit more about your background, anything I may have skipped over. We said where you went to school, but why did you choose physics and science in general, and how long have you been teaching?
Okay, well, starting with that, I taught for over 21 years at BYU, and before that I taught in the University of Idaho system for a while. So I enjoyed teaching. That's one of the things that I really missed after my early retirement at age 57. We'll get to that, but that was pretty tough, actually, to lose that opportunity to teach that way. But anyway, as far as background and teaching, I've done research I've traveled I figured I'd traveled to Japan a dozen times. Mostly that was on muon catalyzed fusion, but also on what's called cold fusion. So energy research, fusion related in particular, has been my, the backbone of my career. So I started back in 1982, before I went to BYU to teach. I was at the Idaho National Engineering Laboratory and proposed the study of muon catalyzed fusion, which turned out to be quite successful, the experiment, and didn't lead us to a source of energy, unfortunately, but we only missed by about a factor of 10, which is pretty good in physics. Why I studied physics is just growing up, I just enjoyed science. I enjoyed chemistry and physics and astronomy. Yeah, you look at the stars, it's pretty fascinating. And how does the sun work? And just inventing little things. I built a Tesla coil when I was, I think that was junior high or early high school. So I just enjoyed playing around, so to speak, in science. A lot of, frankly, of what scientists do is rigorous, but it's still playing around. Hopefully you're making measurements. I'm an experimentalist, so I emphasize measurement, careful measurement, but it has to be enjoyable too. And so as I went through high school and junior high, I took all the science that I could get. I remember cooking a hot dog with electricity. I just plugged first I hooked the two ends of the wire to the two ends of a hot dog, and then I plugged it in. A pretty simple experiment. It cooked it pretty fast. I think it was about 15 seconds, and I thought hot dog that way. So just having fun and studying nature. And then, I got off onto 9/11 studies at the urging of friends to look into it, and frankly it was Building 7, when I saw World Trade Center 7 come down. I didn't see it on the day of 9/11. I didn't see it for a few years there. And when I first started delving into 9/11, I came to Jim Hoffman's website, which presented video evidence for the demise of Building 7. That was truly remarkable. I mean, this is the building, skyscraper, 47-story steel frame skyscraper, which had not been hit by a plane, and yet in the afternoon of 9/11, about 5:20 p.m., it comes down, pretty much symmetrically straight down, and I timed it, and it was very close to free fall. And so, that I just couldn't. I just couldn't let that go. I had to find out what in the world could cause that building to come down. And I'll tell you, it's not. I'm confident that I can say after these studies, it's not fires, which is the explanation by FEMA and NIST. Of course, FEMA had the decency to admit after they did their report on the collapse of World Trade Center 7, we just call it Building 7. But they had the decency to say, let's see if I can quote it here, I've got it in one of my papers. The specifics of the fires in WTC-7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. The best hypothesis, which is their fire hypothesis, has only a low probability of occurrence. Now that's a pretty remarkable statement from a government agency. This is on Building 7. And then later, NIST, you remember, came out with their report. Maybe we can discuss that more. But they likewise have difficulty explaining the collapse of Building 7. It remains a central issue with architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, for example, and just truth-seeking individuals worldwide. We just are not satisfied with the government official explanation that this was due to fire.
You're right. It's one of those things that you don't even need to have the illustrious background that you do. And folks, I mean, I was looking at our guest's papers he's published even before 9/11 happened. I mean, he's been published. I think I saw Scientific American. I've been very impressed with that.
Right.
But you don't even need that background to understand that there's a problem with Building 7. And it's a common line that I always bring up: is all you need are two eyes and common sense, or even one eye and common sense, to know that fire can't do that to a building. And I don't know if it was you who actually originally gave me this line without knowing it. I stole it from someone, but we don't need to go to school for many years to learn how to bring down buildings, to do a controlled demolition. We can start Andy and Steven's controlled demolition company right now just by starting some random fires and watching the building fall down. All right, and so that's ridiculous on its face, but that is what NIST essentially is telling you with its report. It doesn't make sense, and now that we know that there's problems with their data even, it was discovered by researchers doing Freedom of Information Act requests, that just increases the need for a real investigation, which you were calling for early. Now, you talked about the controlled demolition evidence to a certain extent just now. But lay it out. I mean, when you talk to people around the country about this issue, what are the key points, the key things that they should be looking at?
All right. So, I mean, one can get really technical and start looking at computer models and conservation of momentum and energy, and you lose most of your audience in the first 2 minutes. But instead, let's look at just some of the in-your-face evidence that has been reported in newspapers, for example, and in videos, and in readable materials. So let's talk about that. So the evidence I like to point to first, although it's a sensitive issue, it has to do with human bone fragments. And I apologize. This is you have to realize there were nearly 3,000 people murdered in these events on 9/11 in these buildings, including the planes. So if you look at these bone fragments, these were found, hundreds of bone fragments found on the top of the Deutsche Bank building, about 600 feet away from the towers, and the fragments are about half an inch long, quarter inch to half an inch long, and just hundreds of these bone fragments identified, human bone fragments. Now, we can all understand that, and we know how tough our bones are, and to shatter them into half-inch fragments, that points to, and then deliver that to a distance of 2 football fields away. That points to explosives. See, right there. And I can't see how a pancaking collapse, this is popular mechanics, popularized the pancake collapse theory, which is just, look, even NIST in their report on the towers threw out the pancake collapse theory of popular mechanics. I just can't believe people keep raising to me this popular mechanics argument. Because, nobody who's looked at it reasonably buys that. But anyway, in a pancaking collapse, you're trapping stuff in there. And how do you get human bone fragments shattered and then ejected so that they end up 2 football fields away, and in hundreds, of these fragments? So that points to explosives, and I think it doesn't take rocket scientists to understand what's going on here. Somehow, people were killed in a manner that their bones were blasted to small pieces, but measurable pieces. I'm not talking about dustification, which is another idea. But no, these are not turned to dust. These are fragments. They're measurable, they're observable, and they have been looked at. And yet they're distant from the tower, 600 feet distant, so horizontally. So that points again to some explosive agent, both shattering the bones and then ejecting them. And then along similar lines, you've got steel beams. That, as you look at the videos, you can determine the speed of these beams as they're ejected. Again, quite horizontally, some of them with a vertical trajectory as well, 60 miles per hour, and again, ending up 600 feet away from the building in all directions, from the towers now. And how do you do that without explosives? And if you have an energy beam, how do you get the energy to, I mean, what is it that ejects things horizontally? We're not talking about dustification. Again, I'm countering different myths and falsehoods here as I go along, because the evidence is not hard to explain. You just have to look at the actual evidence. So those are two. And then another one I would look at is the acceleration of these buildings. Now let's start with building 7. Probably that's the most interesting one, I think. As I mentioned in dozens of talks, perhaps hundreds, the acceleration of building 7 is close to free fall. And in fact, when NIST first came out with their preliminary report on building 7, they said that they assumed that the rate of fall was constant speed. Now, you're driving along in your car, constant speed, and then you stop. And now when you hit the accelerator, your gas pedal, you accelerate. That's not constant speed. There's a big difference, obviously, which we all can understand, between accelerating and constant speed. When you drop something, say I've got a banana in front of me, drop a banana and it falls and hits the table, nothing in the way, then it falls at free fall acceleration. It's not constant speed. It starts at 0 speed, you're holding it, and then you let it go, and by the time it hits, it's moving along fairly fast. So we've all experienced that. Well, that's free fall acceleration. Nothing in the way is required. So you put, I don't know, I've got a magazine here in front of me. If I just hold that and the banana hits the magazine, it'll move it, but the magazine slows it down. There's mass there. And we experience that. We bump into something, it slows us down. Just the mass of whatever you bump into slows you down. That's conservation of momentum, and you can get equations for that and so on. But free fall acceleration, you don't need those momentum conservation equations, because there's nothing in the way. It's just, the thing just falls. Okay, so now let's look at building 7, the roof of it in particular. So NIST says that they assumed that it fell at constant speed. Well, I knew that was incorrect, and I'd already given dozens of talks on the fact that it's accelerating. And so NIST had a call-in line, a public, actually what it was you email in your questions to NIST, and then they would read the questions. And I had the email address, and I asked them that question. I said, how come you say in your report that this is constant speed? Have you looked at the data? If you look at the videos, you'll see that the thing is accelerating. And they hemmed and they hawed, and they said, well, no, it can't be. How could it accelerate? But it turns out finally one guy took the microphone, and he said, okay, at NIST, and he said, we better look at this. We'll have to relook at the data and see if it's accelerating. David Chandler, a physics teacher and a friend of mine, he called in independently, basically the same question. Why are you not looking at the data for building 7? If you do, you'll find that it's accelerating and close to free fall. So finally, they did. We twisted their arm. This is a formal thing, actually, this review by the public of their preliminary report. And in their final report, they show a graph which plots the acceleration, of World Trade Center 7 for over 100 feet. And they explain this is at G, which is meaning free fall acceleration, 32.2 feet per second squared. They spell it right out. So finally, they had to agree with it, with us. But then the next shoe to fall is, okay, how did you get all this material for over 8 floors out of the way in order for this free fall to proceed? It's observed. Well, they just ignored that part of the question, which is just unscientific, of course, and unbelievable. I mean, they'll admit that there was free fall acceleration, but then they won't look to see what could cause that free fall acceleration. It's just amazing to me. And so that similarly on the towers, here I've got. I'm looking at this paper that I wrote with colleagues, scientists and engineers. This is not as famous, I guess, as the nanothermite paper, but this one is called 14 Points of Agreement. So with official government reports on the World Trade Center destruction. In order to get this published, we took the approaches, we'll first look at reports by NIST, this national laboratory, and FEMA, and show where we find some common ground. And NIST is already throwing out some popular myths about the World Trade Center collapses that we mentioned, like the pancaking theory of popular mechanics, just totally thrown out by NIST. So, there's points where we agreed with them. And the acceleration of the towers we looked at also, and we found that we agreed. And we were glad that they would look at the data and mention, not that they explained it, but at least they mentioned that, here it is, speaking of the tower, the building came down, quote, came down essentially in free fall, as seen in videos, unquote. That's quoting NIST. And that's in this 14 points paper that I mentioned, which is also in a peer-reviewed journal, the Open Civil Engineering Journal, published in 2008. So I think that's a significant paper. Some might not have seen that. That'd be a good homework assignment, if I put on my professor hat and ask people to read that paper, because it's a good one. It came out before the NIST report on Building 7. So it doesn't cover everything, but it covers a lot. And talk about thermite here, and let me read this other from NIST. See, we wrote them a letter, and in those days we really thought NIST might agree to sit down and talk to us, but they refused. But anyway, they did respond to our letter, which was a request for correction. It's a formal, citizens can write the government agencies and say, look, you made a mistake. Here's a request for correction. And the government agency, in this case NIST, is obliged to respond. I mean, I understand it's law. It's like a FOIA. You're getting them to finally respond to you. They don't want to, it's pretty clear, but they finally have to. So anyway, here's what NIST wrote to us. This letter is in response to your April 12, 2007 request for correction. We are unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. Now, this is NIST, National Laboratory, charged by Congress to explain the collapse of the towers. They've already published some 10,000 pages on the collapse of the towers, and yet they come, admirable candor, you'd have to say. They say, we are unable to provide a full explanation. Well, what were they paid, tens of billions of dollars by Congress for? It was for an explanation. And here they come around, they publish 10,000 pages, everybody thinks, oh, that's it, there's your explanation. But when we challenged them, they had to admit that, in fact, they did not have a full explanation. So, there we are. And we published these weaknesses, but they wouldn't talk to us. And another weakness that I might point out, it's in this same 14-point paper. Well, there's several weaknesses in their analysis, but one of them is that NIST claimed that there was no evidence for explosives. So in this case, it was a reporter, Jennifer Abel. I talked to her, and she called up the NIST spokesperson. His name is Newman, Mr. Newman, and she said, what about the letter where NIST said it didn't look for evidence of explosives? And Newman reports, right, because there was no evidence of that. Now you think, well, they must have looked, but they just couldn't find any, but that's not the case. So she continues on, which is to her credit, as the investigative reporter, Abel. She says, how can you know there's no evidence if you don't look for it first? Now here's Newman's reply. It's in this paper. Quote, and it was published in the newspaper. If you're looking for something that isn't there, you're wasting your time. Now, you see how circular that is? It's like, we already know there's no explosives there, so we're not going to look for them, but we're going to say there's no evidence even though we didn't even look. It's just like...
It's so ludicrous you don't even think it's real life. You think you're watching a movie
or
something.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, here we have thousands of people killed, and this evidence in our face of the shattered bones and the beams hurled horizontally 600 feet in all directions. And they're telling us that there's no evidence. Do you have eyes? You know, what is going on? It's just like, I'm afraid I'm seeing it more in science, but of course, this is a national laboratory. They're funded by the federal government. And I suspect that they would be, if they actually look, they'd have to say, well, yeah, there's evidence for explosives, all right, but, you know.
Well, what I find interesting...
Yeah.
Well, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but what I find interesting about this, and I talk to a lot of the experts and scientists involved in the 9/11 Truth movement with regard to the destruction of the buildings in New York, and there are people who are very left-brained, people who look to clear facts, who use logic, and the cover-up, the putting up of the brick wall, the mental brick walls by our society is not very logical. It's based a lot on emotion, and you can kind of see where the world of logic and the world of emotion and cover-up kind of collide with each other in this battle for information. And I'm curious, when you first started speaking out about this and talking about the problems with the Building 7 story, what did you expect would happen? How did that compare with the reality of what happened and how the media and academia responded?
Yeah, well, I suppose I was a bit naive. That is, as a scientist, as you mentioned, the background, I published in Scientific American and Physical Review letters and other prominent publications, and I was pretty well known because of that work on infusion. But in fact, I thought the scientists would lend an ear. Some did, but most just thought, wow, you can't touch that. I mean, you can't even, how can you even question? That would mean that somehow there was some government foreknowledge of 9/11 and plus explosives in the building. I mean, how can you even think of such a thing? You know, it takes some time, weeks, depending on the number of people you have in there to install these explosives like that. So, you know, it's just like out of hand. It's they won't even think about it, and I point out to them that's not very scientific. You're supposed to look at the data and then evaluate it. And you know, we were publishing. I presented a paper in April of 2006 at the Utah Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is well attended, by the way, and the scientists there seemed very receptive, actually, to my arguments. I was talking about thermite at the time, and the evidence, you know, the flowing metal from the South Tower just minutes before it's collapsed, this orange metal, which also NIST, by the way, observed and reported in their report. They just couldn't explain it, you know, but they did report the data, which is to their credit to at least report the data, but you hope they take the next step further. Anyway, it was just like pulling teeth to get people to look at it, and of course people were accusing me of all sorts of things, like well, I don't know if I want to go into it, other than crazy, you know, that's just the obvious. But I point out, I'm not crazy. I have data. I'm talking about data here. I'm not talking about some just wild speculation. Now, one of the things that I did in 2006, which I think did ruffle some feathers, but, you know, in the Constitution, which I also talked about, I admire the founding fathers, and we call them patriots that participated in the Revolution, right? Because we ended up with the Constitution. We respect these Ben Franklin, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and so on. And I have a great deal of respect for them. Well, in the Constitution, they put a provision for citizens to challenge their government. And it's called seeking redress for grievances. Okay. And they also had a provision for impeachment of government authorities. Now, there were certain data, which we haven't talked about yet, having to do with the lack of air defense that day, which is another in-your-face thing. It doesn't take a rocket scientist. You know, where's our air defenses that day? There's 4 planes flying around, and where are the air defenses? And I'd like to talk about Norman Minetta's testimony on that. But anyway, it points to some shaky behavior and actions by Vice President Dick Cheney. You remember, the president was down in Florida reading to the children a little book to these young children. So Cheney was in charge, and we could go into that. But the point is, there is this going on, the lack of air defenses. There was some air defense drills that day that confused the issue. But that same day, and how could that, I mean, it was scheduled, and Cheney was in charge of that. We read, along with, there's some military guys that are suspect, Eberhard and so on. But anyway, the point is, so I joined this movement, which was called the Impeach Cheney First movement. And the idea was to seek redress for grievances as private citizens, to actually impeach Dick Cheney, to have this investigation. And there's that evidence. And by this time, you know, we had gone to war in Iraq, and we knew that Cheney had given certain lies about the presence. You know, we're sure, we have no doubt that there were weapons of mass destruction, armed weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So we have to attack, and so on like that. And other statements by Cheney that led us to see that, you know, there's some lying going on here, or at least something that needs to be terribly much investigated, okay? And so, you know, give him a fair trial. That's what an impeachment is. And let's get to the bottom of 9/11 while we're at it. That's a big part of this impeachment that we sought. And that movement was gaining some steam. And I don't know if you were involved in 2006, but, you know, we met in Arizona, and that was a big push there as we were working on that Impeach Cheney issue. You know, Richard Gage didn't show up till later. But it was after. So anyway, Cheney's still in office, and we had this movement going where we could have had an investigation, but it was so opposed. I mean, you'd think that you have a right to seek for impeachment, you know, redress of grievances. Your countrymen have been killed here, and there's some evidence that the lack of air defenses that day were at least partially responsible. It was Dick Cheney. So we want to find out. And the 9/11 Commission subsequently redacts 28 pages. We still hope we can get those 28 pages, you know. And Cheney did not have to testify under oath. And the testimony of Mineta, Secretary of Transportation, that points directly to Cheney's involvement and obstruction of air defenses that day, that testimony was not included in the 9/11 Commission report. So, I mean, all these things are pointing to cover up and to a need for investigation. And in particular, we were going to focus then was on Cheney. We can see a way to get this done. Well, as I said, that was making considerable progress. And then I'm not the only one, of course, that has been hurt by this effort to get justice. But I was certainly one because I was put on administrative leave by BYU, and in September, it was just before September 11th of 2006. As I said, it was just about the culmination. We'd just been on C-SPAN. I was on C-SPAN, and Alex Jones, and we were making our case, and then kibosh. I was put on administrative leave, and the momentum seemed to be lost there on this Impeach Cheney first movement. And then one other thing, just a few months later, Dick Cheney was invited to BYU, and he was given an honorary PhD for public service by BYU. This is after they had, early retired me. In fact, I was early retired in April of 2007. I'm sorry, I was early retired in January. In April was when they gave Cheney this honorary doctoral degree. So I just, it's not too hard to put two and two together. We're not having to be rocket scientists here. We're just looking at the evidence that's in our faces. But I just feel so bad that I wasn't able to do more to pursue that. I got kiboshed, and I recognized that my influence diminished dramatically at that time, and since then. But you try, but the opposition is formidable. It really is to the truth in this matter. 9/11.
It's funny because we talk about how we want to just talk about the science, how we just want to get a new investigation and let the chips fall where they may, but you run into politics all the time. I've seen it firsthand. It's embarrassing how people who are so-called intellectuals fawn over politicians. I mean, politicians are there because they manipulate the public. That's kind of a no-duh statement I'm making, but it does need to be stated. And the fact that Dick Cheney is getting an honorary degree just for figuring out how to become vice president, which is a lot of it is just deception in politics. Both sides, Republican and Democrat. And I think the public audience knows that.
Good point,
and I want to ask you about that period where you were early retired from BYU. I mean, how did that come about? What was the discussions? How did you find out about that?
Well, of course, I found out about it when they put me on administrative leave, which was, I felt blindsided. That was just a few days before September 11th, and I was scheduled to give various interviews and so on, and which I tried to continue with. But the news was, this is the guy that BYU finds has to be kicked out or something. So it's very painful, and I think that was. Humiliating is of course, I'm a full professor of physics. I'm published in Scientific American and other top journals of physics. I traveled to Russia giving talks, and to China. I'm sorry, not to China, to Japan, doing experiments and talks, and of course Europe many times. Wife and I love to go to Italy. But then out of the blue, I'm put on administrative leave, kaboom. And now, let me just explain one thing. This was in the newspapers, so it's not a new revelation here or something, but the fact is, I was pretty upset. And so I asked for a hearing, a review. In writing, I requested a review with me present, of course, so that I could understand. Now, a review goes both ways. I thought I would explain about what I was learning from experiments and observations about 9/11, and then I expected the university to explain just why they put me on administrative leave and what was going on there. Well, they held out the possibility of review for a while, and you'll see that in the newspapers too. But at the end, they they told me they would not have a review. There would be no review with me present.
So, what rights do you have as a professor there? I mean, so they don't have to do that, right? That's basically up to their discretion.
I think it is. It's a private university, and so I suppose that is up to their discretion. I mean, it would have been kind of them, perhaps, to to a full professor to give a review. There is, again, the Constitution talks about due process, and we talk about this a lot in our church, which is a church school, but about due process and being fair. And there was even a statement for employees that if you do something wrong, you'll be told what you did wrong in writing and what you need to do to correct it. Well, I never received that. So, what did I do wrong? I still don't have an answer to that question.
Well, that's what this period in history is all about, folks. And I say this to the future, folks who might be listening to this program long after both me and the guests are gone. This was the state of academia in the post-9/11 world, the big elephant in the room that you can't talk about. As an educator, obviously, you've experienced the consequence of talking about this. I still think it was worth it for you, and you're a hero for doing it. What do you have to say to other educators, whether they be in college, high school, even elementary school, who know about this? And here we are, the anniversary of 9/11 coming up, and the terrorist attack just because of our freedom stuff, and fires brought down the buildings story. When this comes up, what would you advise them to do? How should they handle it? What kind of strategies should they employ in trying to not push the official lie, but also be truthful and not trying to stir up too much controversy if they don't want to?
Yeah, let me address that a bit. So, of course, as a scientist, I would encourage them to be critical thinkers, to look at the data themselves, look at videos of the collapse of Building 7 in particular. Please read my reviewed papers, which, by the way, if you will, it's interesting, if you Google doctor, that is Dr. space BYU, Dr. BYU, that kind of, my web page, which is still at BYU, to their credit, they allow me to have a web page there, and it has some of these there's 4 principal peer-reviewed papers, and 3 of them are linked at my web page. You just Google Dr. BYU and click on the top page, which is my web page there, and I mean, it may not stay on top forever. I don't suppose it will. I'm surprised after, I was retired 8 years ago, 8.5 years ago, and it's still the top. If you talk to Dr. BYU, it's still the top thing comes up is my webpage there. But it links to these peer-reviewed papers. I'd urge people to read those and note that there has been no peer-reviewed rebuttal of these papers. There's 4 of them. The one is in the Utah Academy of Arts and Sciences. That's published, but it's not available online. The other 3 are available online. So I would start there. Do your own research. Be critical thinkers. I mean, that's just almost a given. That's what we're supposed to do as scientists and engineers. By the way, the other I would point to is Architects and Engineers for 9/11truth.org. And if you just Google AE 911 Truth, you'll get that website. Tremendous group. So they have over 2,200 architects and engineers, professionals, who signed a petition requesting this investigation of 9/11 that we've been talking about, and nearly 20,000 other supporters. You don't have to be an architect or engineer to sign up as a supporter, and I'd urge people listening to do that. And I'd like to see that 20,000 supporter mark reached here. That'd be great. I really congratulate Richard Gage and others, volunteers and others working with AE 9/11 Truth. Of course, I signed up years ago, and I was there when Richard talked to Kevin Ryan and myself about his plan to establish AE 9/11 Truth. Just at the inception, of course, I thought it was a great idea, and he has done just tremendous, in my opinion, and is a flagship for this research today. As far as avoiding controversy, I can't really encourage that too much. I think it's important. I mean, think of your children and your grandchildren. Come on. I mean, yeah, it's controversial to support the truth. I mean, but look at, I don't know, I'm thinking of Socrates comes to mind. What happened to him? Okay, but he's looking for an honest man, and they killed him, And throughout the ages, a truth seeker like Galileo comes to mind as well. But now you have some people like Graham McQueen. He's in Canada, and somehow he manages to continue to speak about 9/11 without being ousted. That's a pretty good trick, I'll tell you. And in this country, United States, it's more difficult, but if you're retired, no problem, right? They can't do much to you then. And in fact, I find a lot of retired scientists are very interested and more willing to stick their neck out at that point. So you have people, emeritus professors, coming along and supporting. So that's good. It's just we have to realize, I guess, that in the United States, a lot of science seems to be politicized. We could talk about examples. I think of big pharma, for example. The politics that goes into getting some, like aspartame, which I am certainly not a fan of aspartame, but is approved by the FDA. Well, I won't touch the stuff. If I find out it's in something, I will not take it. Same with monosodium glutamate. But it's approved by the FDA. And you have various drugs that Big Pharma promotes that I don't want any part of either, that have terrible side effects. But it's not just Big Pharma. You've got Big Agriculture, Monsanto. And I'm really opening my mouth now, aren't I?
It's a perfect example of how politicized science has become, just like you said. And I had a lawyer on the program half a year ago, and he basically laid out the reality of our justice system and how blind justice is really just an ideal. It's not a reality. And the same goes in terms of government. You kind of grow up in this world thinking that, once you enter adulthood, there's this kind of supercomputer, not literally, but this machine that looks out for you. And I love it in conspiracy movies where there's some conspiracy going on about how the hero just presents the evidence to the news at the end and everything gets wrapped up and they report it and it's all that. I mean, you and I and anybody who's been involved in this know that's not exactly the reality. You don't get the secret information to the president and he says, "Oh my God," and the day is saved. That's not how it works. And I'm curious from your own perspective, talking right now as somebody who's been retired and talking to students here at 9/11 Free Fall University, what would you say to them about what they need to do for the future, for 9/11 Truth, for these other topics, about challenging the authority of the establishment and what their responsibility is?
I do think that we have a responsibility to future generations, to our own grandchildren, to seek the truth, to be critical thinkers, to speak out where we see falsehood or cover-up being promoted. We see that in the government. I think most people are getting to feel quite aware that the government is not always telling us the truth. This is starting to be quite obvious. And so, Benghazi, Fast and Furious, I don't know, Obamacare, you can stick with your same doctor and don't worry about price increases. Well, whoa, the reality is quite different from what they were told by certain government leaders, and that's true of Big Pharma, big banks, I think, big agriculture, so on. So you have that, and it does seem that there's a collusion between government and big corporations, these international globalist corporations, which is quite worrisome. I'd like to talk a little about energy, but what I would encourage students to do is not to despair, but to be aware, first of all, and prepare. That's almost a little poem there, but it just came out that way. But, you have to prepare, so what? I mean, things are not likely to get dramatically better until a lot of people are aware and awaken to what's going on. We do have a chance. I would not despair. We do have an opportunity. Well, let me mention one thing, Andy, is I think our time is starting to get a little shorter. I have, since I retired, along with 9/11, I'm still working with David Ray Griffin, for example, on the 9/11 Consensus Panel, which is another website that I think people find. They may not have heard of it so much, because the AE 9/11 Truth is quite visible, but this Consensus Panel, there's probably about 24 of us reviewing various investigations regarding 9/11. Kevin Ryan's book is another wonderful contribution. Was it The Other 19, I think it's called? I don't have that in front of me, but I enjoyed reading it perhaps a year ago. Anyway, in addition to these things, to being aware and helping others to be aware, helping others to find the facts through these websites that we talked about, these published peer-reviewed papers that I alluded to, linkable on my web page. So the other thing is, I'd like to encourage people to keep an open mind about energy, and that's where I've focused my career, and I'm still trying to contribute to that effort. And basically what we're trying, everybody's heard of cold fusion, and again, it's derided by mainstream scientists. But there was a conference summer of, just about a year ago, 2013, at the University of Missouri. I gave a paper there, and I was one of the contributors to cold fusion back when, 1989, we started our study in 1985. I wrote a paper in that field with Clint Van Sickman. They're a brilliant physicist. And we talked about fusion in the metallic hydrogen core of Jupiter. But that's cold fusion in metals with hydrogen and so on. So we got our, again, it was quite enlightening, the approach of the scientific community to these ideas and these experiments. But the experiments continue on. And in a nutshell, there's hope for a new energy source out there. And I've had some opposition on that too, but I've learned that opposition doesn't mean that the opposing parties are correct. That's not, we decide correctness using experiments. That I would encourage students to check that out. This is Galileo we're talking about here, doing experiments. And Newton and Copernicus and doing experiments, Max or Faraday, another good example, doing experiments and learning just what nature gives to us, what we can get from nature. This dependence we have, it's almost a slavery now to fossil fuel, is, I think, an underlying problem in our society, Western society. And we can diminish our dependence on fossil fuels by seeking new energy sources and more efficient use, much more efficient use of fossil fuels. Diesel, for example, has some real promise to it, I could say, from research I've been involved in. Diesel engines and generators, solar, the efficiency is increasing dramatically. There's surprises regarding splitting of water. Pretty exciting. which could very well lead to breakthrough in energy production. I would say that probably in the next year, by the end of 2015, we should have a breakthrough in energy, which my hope is that it will help release the stranglehold on science, but also on the public of this domination and control of fossil fuels and the media and big pharma and big agriculture and big banks. So how do we release that? As I learn more about what's going on, I think energy in the hands of the people might be a way to help relieve these other chains. That's my hope, is that a new energy source might, along with awareness of what's going on, which we're talking about, which you've done a great service, I think, Andy, in your program. So awareness and then this energy, I think, could be a key to this new renaissance that we seek, that we hope for.
If anybody wants to follow you and, not just 9/11, but what you're talking about with energy, do you have a web page, any way that our audience can follow up with you?
Yeah. A lot of my research, it's not that it's secret, it's just that it's slow and painful. But anyway, I wish it were faster. Again, with one guy and hardly any budget, I'm doing my best. But it is a worldwide effort, so I shouldn't say that. It's quite hopeful that through our efforts as a worldwide community in energy research, including this broad umbrella, cold fusion. I know people don't like to hear the term, lots don't, but knee-jerk establishment reaction against it, but there's some positive developments there. Anyway, I would point to, again, Dr. BYU, and if you go there on the left, it has, you can click to energy research, I think is what it says. And if you click on that, it'll take you to a forum where I'm updating, not regularly, but I do present my energy research. And that's one of the forums where this energy research is discussed. But there are others, and bigger ones too, but I just chose that one because I have a good working relationship with the forum there, the people in charge, and they allow me to so I've got some history there on my energy research and also some of the latest efforts that I'm involved in with energy that you asked about. Yeah.
Well, we're going to leave it there because we are out of time. We'll have that webpage linked up at 9/11 Freefall for everybody to follow up. Thank you so much for coming on this special anniversary edition. We hope to have you on again soon.
Thanks, Andy. My pleasure. My great pleasure.
You can hear this program every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also download MP3s of this show from the Internet Archive by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.